Pictures of birth certificates, adoption papers, and payment records that tell a very interesting story about the summer before your supposed birth. The crowd around us had grown completely silent, hanging on every word like they were watching the most dramatic movie of their lives. But this wasn't entertainment anymore. This was real life, real secrets, and real consequences playing out in front of them. If you've ever wondered what it feels like to hold someone's entire world in your hands, let me tell you, it's both terrifying and exhilarating. I could see Ashton's whole identity crumbling in real time. Could watch 17 years of certainty dissolving like sugar in rain. Part of me felt sorry for him, but a bigger part of me remembered every cruel comment, every public humiliation. Every time he'd made me feel like I was less than human, simply because my family didn't have money. Serafina, he said, and for the first time in all the years I'd known him. My name didn't sound like an insult when he said it. It sounded like a plea. Please, please what? I asked, my voice gaining strength with every word. Please keep quiet so you can continue pretending to be someone you're not. Please let you keep bullying kids like me while you walk around wearing a life that doesn't even belong to you. Please protect the lie that your whole family has been living for 70 years. The library had filled with what felt like half the school, word spreading faster than wildfire that something major was happening between the mayor's son and the poor girl from Sunset Acres. Teachers had started to notice the commotion, but none of them seemed willing to interrupt what was clearly a moment of reckoning. How? Ashton asked, his voice barely audible. How did you know? Because unlike you, I pay attention to details, I said, surprised by how calm I felt in the eye of this storm I'd created. Because I listen when adults think I'm not listening. Because I remember things that don't quite add up. Like how your mother talks about your birth like it was the most traumatic experience of her life. Or how your father always changes the subject when anyone mentions your early childhood. Or how you don't have a single baby picture displayed in your house despite your mother's obsession with photography. Each observation hit him like a physical blow, and I could see the truth settling into his bones like a weight he'd never be able to shake off. The golden boy of Millbrook High was discovering that his entire life was built on a foundation of lies, and I was the one holding the hammer that had just shattered it all. But here's the thing about truth, and I want you to really think about this. When you reveal someone's deepest secret, especially in such a public way, you're not just changing their life, you're changing your own. The girl who had walked into that library 20 minutes earlier was gone forever, replaced by someone who had just discovered she had power she never knew existed. And power, as they say, changes everything. The next few minutes were chaos. Students were whispering frantically, phones were appearing to capture every moment, and teachers were finally starting to push through the crowd to restore order. But before anyone could separate us, before the moment could be lost to adult intervention, I did something that surprised everyone, including myself. I stepped even closer to Ashton, close enough that only he could hear what I said next. I'm not going to tell anyone else, I whispered. Not today, anyway. But you're going to stop. The bullying, the comments, the making people feel small just because you can. Because now you know how it feels to have your whole world turned upside down by someone else's words. And if you ever make anyone else feel the way you've made me feel, I'll make sure every person in this town knows exactly who you really are. The relief on his face was immediate and profound, but it was mixed with something else. Respect, maybe, or fear, probably both. Why? He asked. Why are you giving me a chance? Because, I said, stepping back as Mrs. Henderson, our head librarian, finally reached us. Everyone deserves a chance to be better than they were yesterday. Even you, Ashton Kensington Blake. Even you, The crowd dispersed reluctantly as teachers began shooing students back to their classes, but the energy in the air had changed permanently. Word would spread, rumors would fly, but without confirmation from me, it would all remain speculation. I had given Ashton the gift of time, the opportunity to process this revelation and decide what to do with it. But more importantly, I had given myself something I'd never had before, the knowledge that I was nobody's victim. Walking home that afternoon, my dirty shoes carrying me along the familiar path from the school to Sunset Acres, I felt different. The August heat seemed less oppressive, the weight of my backpack less burdensome, and the sounds of our neighborhood less like a reminder of what I lacked and more like a symphony of home. The smell of Mama's cornbread drifted from our trailer as I approached, mixed with the scent of Roy's aftershave and the faint aroma of motor oil that permanently clung to everything he touched. "How was school, baby girl?" Mama called from the kitchen as I dropped my bag by the door. She was standing at the stove, her uniform from the diner still on, but her feet bare, her dark hair escaping from its ponytail in the way that meant she'd had a long day. "Interesting," I said, which was probably the understatement of the century. Roy looked up from his position at the kitchen table, where he was going through bills with the same methodical patience he brought to fixing engines. "Interesting how?" he asked, his eyes crinkling with concern. Roy had a way of seeing through my attempts to downplay things, probably because he'd spent enough years reading my moods to know when something significant had happened. I sat down across from him, studying the man who'd chosen to love my mama, and, by extension, me, even though he didn't have to. Roy wasn't my biological father, but he'd been more of a dad to me than some kids got from their real parents. He'd taught me how to change a tire, how to throw a punch if I ever needed to defend myself, and how to hold my head high even when the world seemed determined to keep it down. "Just some drama at school," I said, which was technically true. "Nothing I couldn't handle." Mama turned from the stove, wiping her hands on a dish towel and giving me that look that mothers perfect over years of practice. "What kind of drama?" "The kind where I learned that sometimes knowing the truth can be more powerful than actually telling it," I said carefully. Roy's eyebrows went up slightly, and he set down the bill he'd been examining. "That sounds like wisdom beyond your years. Syrah, want to talk about it?" The thing about having parents who actually listen is that sometimes you want to tell them everything, and sometimes you want to protect them from the weight of your world. This felt like one of those times when the truth was mine to carry, at least for now. "Maybe later," I said. "Right now, I just want to enjoy Mama's cornbread and pretend like the rest of the world doesn't exist." Delilah smiled at that, the kind of smile that reached all the way to her eyes and reminded me why Roy had fallen in love with her, despite all the complications that came with taking on a woman with a teenage daughter and a past she didn't like. To discuss that as we sat around our small table, sharing a meal that had been prepared with love, even if it hadn't cost much to make, I found myself thinking about secrets, about the ones we keep to protect ourselves, and the ones we keep to protect others, about the power that comes with knowing something that could change lives, and the responsibility that comes with deciding what to do with that knowledge. Have you ever been in a position where you held someone else's future in your hands? Drop a comment below and let me know how you handled it, because I was about to learn that having power over someone else's truth was just the beginning of a journey I never could have anticipated. The next morning at school, everything felt different. Not just for me, but for everyone. The story of what had happened in the library had spread through Millbrook High like wildfire. But because the details were sparse and I hadn't confirmed anything, it had transformed into the kind of gossip that gets bigger and more dramatic with each telling. By the time I walked through the front doors, I was apparently some kind of detective who had uncovered a conspiracy involving half the town's founding families. Ashton was nowhere to be seen during first period, or second, or third. It wasn't until lunch that I spotted him sitting alone at a table in the far corner of the cafeteria, staring at a sandwich he clearly had no intention of eating. The usual crowd of followers and admirers had mysteriously found other places to sit, leaving him isolated in a way that was probably foreign to someone who'd spent his entire life being the center of attention. I hesitated for a moment, tray in hand, before making a decision that would have seemed impossible just 24 hours earlier. I walked over to his table and sat down across from him. "Mind if I join you?" I asked, even though I was already settling into the uncomfortable plastic chair. He looked up at me with eyes that were red-rimmed and exhausted, like he'd spent the night staring at the ceiling and questioning everything he thought he knew about himself. "Why would you want to sit with me?" he asked, his voice hoarse. "Because," I said, opening my milk carton with deliberate calm, "you look like I felt yesterday morning, and nobody should have to eat lunch alone when their whole world has just been turned upside down." For a moment I thought he might cry. His face crumpled slightly, and his hands clenched into fists on the table. But then he seemed to pull himself together, straightening his shoulders and looking at me with something that might have been gratitude. "I talked to my parents last night," he said quietly, and you were right about everything." He laughed, but there was no humor in it. 17 years of my life, and it was all just a story they made up. My real mother was 16 years old, Serafina, 16, just like us. The weight of that revelation settled between us like a living thing. A 16-year-old girl, barely older than we were now, had given birth to the boy sitting across from me, and then disappeared from his life forever. The magnitude of what that meant, for her and for him, was almost too big to comprehend. "Do you know anything about her?" I asked gently. "Just that she was from somewhere near Nashville, and that she worked at a diner to save up money for the bus ticket to get here. My parents, my adoptive parents, they met her through some kind of private arrangement. No agencies, no lawyers, just cash and a promise that they'd give her baby a good life." "And they did," I pointed out. "Give you a good life, I mean. Whatever else you want to say about your parents, they love you. That's obvious to anyone who's ever seen you together." He nodded slowly. "They do. But they also lied to me every single day for 17 years. They let me build my entire identity around being a Kensington Blake, around belonging to this family legacy, and none of it was real." "But you're still you," I said. "The name might be different, the biology might be different, but you're still the same person you were yesterday. You still have the same talents, the same dreams, the same ability to choose who you want to be." "Do I, though?" he asked. "Because the person I was yesterday was cruel to you, cruel to a lot of people, and I don't even know why. Maybe it was because deep down I knew something was wrong, knew I didn't really belong, and I was taking it out on everyone else." It was probably the first time in his life that Ashton Kensington Blake had engaged in genuine self-reflection, and I could see how painful it was for him. Growth hurts. Change hurts. Confronting the ugly parts of yourself hurts more than almost anything else in the world. "Or maybe," I said carefully, "you were cruel because it's easy to be cruel when you've never had to face consequences for it. Maybe you were cruel because nobody ever taught you empathy, because your world was so insulated that you never had to think about how your actions affected other people." "That's not an excuse." "No," I agreed, "it's not. But it is an explanation, and sometimes understanding why we do things is the first step toward doing them differently." The cafeteria buzzed with conversation around us, but our corner felt like a bubble of quiet intensity. Other students were staring, of course. The sight of Serafina Holloway and Ashton Kensington Blake having what appeared to be a civil conversation was probably the most shocking thing that had happened in Millbrook. high since the drama teacher had eloped with the school custodian 3 years earlier. "I owe you an apology," Ashton said suddenly. "Not just for yesterday, but for every day before that. For every comment, every look, every time I made you feel like you were worth less than everyone else. You didn't deserve any of that." "No," I said. "I didn't. But I'm not the only one you owe apologies to." He nodded, understanding immediately. "I know. I've been thinking about everyone I've hurt, everyone I've made feel small, and the list is longer than I want to admit. So what are you going to do about it?" Before he could answer, a shadow fell across our table. We looked up to see Magnolia. June Crawford, my best friend since 3rd grade, standing there with her lunch tray and an expression of complete bewilderment. "Sierra," she said slowly, "what exactly is happening here?" Magnolia June was one of those people who said exactly what she was thinking, consequences be damned. She came from a farming family that had worked the same land for 4 generations. And she had the kind of straightforward honesty that comes from people who can't afford to waste time on bullshit. She also had my back in every situation, which meant she was probably ready to defend me from whatever manipulation she assumed Ashton was attempting. "We're talking," I said simply. "Talking," she repeated, like the word was foreign to her. "About what?" "About how people can change if they want to badly enough," Ashton said, surprising us both with his directness. "About how I've been a terrible person and how I want to figure out how to be better." Magnolia June stared at him for a long moment, then looked at me, then back at him. "Well," she said finally, settling into the chair next to mine, "this is definitely not how I expected lunch to go today." The 3 of us sat there in silence for a moment, an unlikely trio united by the strange circumstances that had brought us together. Magnolia June was everything I wasn't. Tall, confident, unafraid to speak her mind, and completely comfortable with who she was. She wore her farming background like armor, proud of the calluses on her hands and the mud under her fingernails. Next to her, Ashton looked almost fragile, like a person who was discovering that everything he'd thought made him strong was actually just an illusion. "So," Magnolia June said, breaking the silence with characteristic bluntness, "are you going to tell me what happened yesterday, or am I going to have to piece it together from all the wild rumors flying around this place?" I looked at Ashton, and he looked at me, and in that moment I realized we had crossed some kind of threshold. We were in this together now, whatever this was. "Let's just say," I said carefully, "that yesterday I learned some things about the power of truth, and Ashton learned some things about the danger of assumptions." "That's the most diplomatic non-answer I've ever heard," Magnolia June said with a laugh. "But I guess if you're not ready to talk about it, that's your business. Just know that whatever's going on, I've got your back, Sarah. Same as always." The loyalty in her voice made my chest tight with emotion. Having a friend like Magnolia June was worth more than all the designer clothes and expensive shoes in the world. And sitting there at that cafeteria table, I realized I was lucky in ways that had nothing to do with money. The rest of lunch passed in surprisingly comfortable conversation. Ashton asked questions about our lives, our families, our plans for the future, and for the first time, he seemed genuinely interested in the answers. He told us about his confusion over his identity, his anger at his parents, and his uncertainty about what came next. By the time the bell rang, signaling the end of lunch period, something had shifted between the 3 of us. Walking to 5th period AP History, Magnolia June grabbed my arm and pulled me aside. "Okay," she said, "I don't know what magic you worked on that boy, but this is either the beginning of something really good or the setup for something really bad. Please tell me you know what you're doing." "Honestly," I said, "I have no idea what I'm doing, but for the first time in my life, I feel like I have some control over my own story, and that's worth the risk." "Just be careful," she warned. "People Like Ashton Kensington Blake, don't just change overnight, no matter what secrets you might know about them. She was right to be cautious, and I appreciated her concern. But as I watched Ashton walk down the hallway ahead of us, his shoulders set with what looked like determination rather than his usual arrogance, I had a feeling that sometimes people surprise you. Sometimes the worst circumstances bring out the best in people, and sometimes discovering who you really are is the first step toward becoming who you're meant to be. The rest of the week passed in a blur of whispered conversations, curious stares, and a gradually shifting social dynamic that nobody quite knew how to navigate. Ashton kept his word about changing his behavior, and the difference was immediately noticeable. He stopped making cutting remarks about people's clothes or backgrounds. He started eating lunch with different groups instead of holding court with the same circle of admirers. Most surprisingly, he began volunteering to tutor younger students in math, something that required patience and kindness, rather than the cruel wit he'd been known for. But the most significant change was in how he treated me. Gone were the sneering comments and public humiliations. Instead, he offered genuine apologies to people he'd hurt, started conversations about books and movies and ideas rather than appearances and social status, and began what felt like a sincere effort to understand the world from perspectives other than his own. The turning point came on Friday afternoon. I was walking home from school, taking the long route because the October air was crisp and beautiful, and I wasn't in any hurry to get back to the chaos of Sunset Acres. When I heard footsteps behind me, I turned to see Ashton jogging to catch up, his expensive backpack bouncing against his shoulders. "Serafina," he called, slightly out of breath. "Wait up." I stopped walking and turned to face him, curious about what could be so important that he'd run after me. "I wanted to ask you something," he said, coming to a stop a few feet away. "And I want you to know that it's okay if the answer is no, okay?" I said slowly. "What is it?" "There's this thing tomorrow night, a harvest festival downtown, with live music and food trucks and dancing in the square. It's probably not your scene, and it's definitely not something we'd normally do. We've never." He stopped, took a breath, and tried again. "Would you maybe want to go with me? Not as a date," he added quickly. "Just as friends, or whatever we are now." I stared at him for a moment, trying to process the fact that Ashton Kensington Blake had just asked me to attend a public event with him. A week ago, he would have sooner eaten glass than be seen in social setting with the poor girl from Sunset Acres. Now he was standing here looking nervous and hopeful and completely genuine. "Why?" I asked. "Because I think I'd like to see the festival through your eyes," he said. "Because I've spent 17 years seeing this town one way, and this week has made me realize there are other ways to see it. Because I think you might be the most interesting person I've ever met, and I'd like to get to know you better. And because you feel guilty," I added. "And because I feel guilty," he admitted. "But not just guilty, grateful, too. You could have destroyed my life on Tuesday, Serafina. You could have stood up in front of everyone and told them exactly what you knew, and I would have deserved every bit of humiliation that followed. Instead, you gave me a chance to process it privately, to have a conversation with my parents, to figure out who I want to be now that I know who I really am. That's not something I'll ever forget." His honesty was disarming, and I found myself considering his invitation more seriously than I probably should have. The practical part of my brain reminded me that people were complicated, that change was hard, and that just because someone said they wanted to be different didn't mean they actually could be. But another part of me, the part that had always believed in second chances and the possibility of redemption, was curious about what it might be like to spend an evening with this new version of Ashton. "Can I bring Magnolia June?" I asked. "Of course," he said immediately. "She can keep you safe from me if I turn out to still be an asshole." I laughed despite myself. "Okay," I said. "Yes, we'll meet you there at 7. The smile that spread across his face was unlike any expression I'd ever seen from him before. It was genuine and grateful, and maybe a little bit amazed, like he couldn't quite believe I'd said yes. "Thank you," he said. "Really, thank you." As I watched him walk back toward the main part of town, I wondered what I'd just gotten myself into. But for the first time in my life, the uncertainty felt like possibility rather than danger. That night at dinner, I told Mama and Roy about the festival invitation, carefully editing out the more dramatic details of how this unlikely friendship had come about. "Ashton Kensington Blake asked you to the Harvest Festival," Mama said, setting down her fork and staring at me like I'd just announced I was joining the circus. "Not like a date," I said quickly. "Just as friends. And Magnolia June is coming too." Roy leaned back in his chair, studying me with the careful attention he usually reserved for particularly complex engine problems. "That's quite a change in social dynamics," he said thoughtfully. "Any particular reason for this sudden friendship?" "People change," I said, which was true even if it wasn't the whole truth. "Maybe he's finally growing up." "Maybe," Mama said, but her tone suggested she wasn't entirely convinced. "Just be careful, baby girl. Boys like that, they're used to getting what they want, and they don't always think about the consequences for other people." "I know, Mama, but I think this might be different." She reached across the table and took my hand, her fingers rough from years of hard work but warm with love. "I trust your judgment, Sierra. You've always been smart about people. Just remember that you don't owe anyone anything, no matter what they might have done for you or said to you. You're worth respect exactly as you are." Her words stayed with me. As I got ready for the festival the next evening, choosing my best jeans and the sweater Mama had splurged on for my birthday, braiding my hair in a way that made me feel pretty without trying too hard, Magnolia June picked me up in her family's old pickup truck, looking skeptical but supportive in the way that only best friends can manage. "I still think this is weird," she said as we drove toward downtown. "But I guess weird isn't necessarily bad. And if he tries anything inappropriate, I've got pepper spray and a very protective older brother who knows how to use a shotgun. It's going to be fine," I said, though I wasn't entirely sure I believed it myself. The festival was already in full swing when we arrived. The town square transformed into something magical, with strings of lights crisscrossed between the trees, and the sound of bluegrass music floating on the crisp evening air. Food trucks lined the streets, selling everything from barbecue to funnel cakes, and families were spread out on blankets, watching local bands perform on a small stage set up in front of the courthouse. We found Ashton waiting by the gazebo, wearing jeans and a simple button-down shirt instead of his usual expensive outfits. He looked nervous, but genuinely happy to see us, and when he smiled at me, there was none of the calculated charm I was used to seeing from him. This was just a 17-year-old boy, trying to figure out how to navigate a friendship that had begun under the most unusual circumstances. "You came," he said, and I could hear the relief in his voice. "I said I would," I replied. "I know, but I wasn't entirely sure you wouldn't change your mind. When Sierra says she do something, she does it," Magnolia June said, inserting herself into the conversation with characteristic directness. "It's one of her best qualities. Also one of her most stubborn qualities, depending on the situation." Ashton laughed, a real laugh that reached his eyes. I'm beginning to understand that about her. What followed was one of the most unexpectedly pleasant evenings of my life. We wandered through the festival together, sampling food from different trucks, listening to music, and talking about everything and nothing. Ashton was funny and thoughtful, and surprisingly easy to be around when he wasn't trying to maintain some kind of social hierarchy. He asked questions about our lives, our dreams, our opinions on everything from music to politics to whether pineapple belonged on pizza. And he actually listened to the answers. When the band started playing slower songs and couples began dancing in the square, I expected him to make some excuse and disappear. Instead, he surprised me by extending his hand. "Dance with me," he asked. "I promise I'm not as bad as I look." I hesitated for a moment, aware that dancing with Ashton Kensington Blake in front of half the town was going to generate gossip that would last for months. But then I looked at his face, saw the genuine hope there, and decided I didn't care what people thought. "Okay," I said, taking his hand. He led me to the edge of the dancing area, where we were visible but not the center of attention, and pulled me into a simple, slow dance. He smelled like soap and cologne, and his hand was warm against my back. And for a few minutes, the complicated history between us faded into something that felt remarkably like normal teenage romance. "Thank you," he said softly as we swayed to the music. "For what?" "For giving me a chance to be better. For seeing something in me that I didn't even know was there. For not giving up on me when you had every reason to." I looked up at him, this boy who had been my tormentor and was now my unlikely friend, and realized that somewhere in the space of a week, my entire world had shifted. Not just because of what I'd learned about his past, but because of what I'd learned about myself, about my own strength, my own worth, and my own capacity to forgive without forgetting. "Everyone deserves a chance to grow," I said. "Even you." He smiled at that, spinning me around gently before pulling me back into the dance. "Especially me," he said. As the song ended and we stepped apart, I caught sight of Magnolia June watching us from her spot near the lemonade stand. She gave me a thumbs up and a grin that suggested she was beginning to believe this transformation might actually be real. But the evening wasn't over yet, and the most significant moment was still to come. We were walking back toward Magnolia. June, laughing about something silly Ashton had said about the band's enthusiastic but off-key fiddle player, when we were intercepted by a group of Ashton's usual friends. Jeremy Morrison, Blake Caldwell, and Tiffany Chen approached us with expressions that ranged from curious to hostile, clearly intent on reclaiming their social leader from whatever spell they assumed I had cast over him. "There you are," Jeremy said, his voice carrying that edge of possessiveness that comes with long-standing friendships. "We've been looking for you everywhere. Come on, there's a party at Blake's house. His parents are out of town." I started to step back, assuming this was where the evening would end, where Ashton would remember his real social circle and leave me behind. But instead of immediately agreeing or making excuses, he glanced at me and then back at his friends. "Thanks, but I'm good here," he said casually. "You're good here," Tiffany repeated, looking at me like I was some kind of exotic species never encountered before. "Ashton, what's going on? Since when do you hang out with?" She trailed off, apparently unable to find a polite way to finish that sentence. "Since when do I hang out with people who are actually interesting?" Ashton finished for her. "Since I realized there's more to life than the same boring conversations with the same boring people about the same boring drama." The silence that followed was thick with tension. Jeremy's face flushed red with anger or embarrassment. Blake looked confused, and Tiffany appeared to be calculating whether this was some kind of elaborate joke. "Are you seriously choosing her over us?" Jeremy asked, his voice rising slightly. "I'm choosing to be myself instead of whatever version of me you guys expect," Ashton replied calmly. "And if that's a problem for you, then maybe we need to reevaluate what our friendship is actually based on." It was a line in the sand, drawn clearly and without hesitation. Ashton was publicly choosing a different path, a different way of being, and he was doing it in front of people who had defined his social identity for years. The courage that took, the risk he was accepting, the statement he was making about who he wanted to be, all of it hit me with surprising force. "Fine," Jeremy said after a moment. "But don't come crawling back when you realize what you're giving up." "I won't," Ashton said simply. His friends walked away, muttering among themselves, leaving the three of us standing there in the aftermath of what felt like a small revolution. "Well," Magnolia June said, appearing at my elbow with perfect timing. "That was dramatic. Are you okay?" "Yeah," Ashton said, and he sounded like he meant it. "Actually, I think I'm better than okay. I think I'm finally figuring out who I actually want to be." The rest of the evening passed peacefully, filled with easy conversation and comfortable silences. When it was time to leave, Ashton walked us back to Magnolia June's truck, thanking us both for an amazing evening and asking if we'd like to do it again sometime. "There's a football game next Friday," he said. "I know school sports probably aren't your thing, but I thought maybe we could go together as friends," he added quickly, looking at both of us. "Will your fan club be there?" Magnolia June asked with characteristic bluntness. "Probably," he admitted. "But I'm hoping I can start building a new fan club, one based on something other than fear and social status." I looked at this boy who had spent so much energy making me feel small and was now putting himself in vulnerable positions to try to make amends. And I felt something shift in my chest. Not love, not yet, but the possibility of it. The recognition that underneath all the privilege and posturing, there might be someone worth caring about. "Okay," I said. "We'll see you at the game." His smile was radiant. "Really? Really?" As we drove home, Magnolia June was unusually quiet, lost in thought as she navigated the familiar roads back to our part of town. "What are you thinking?" I asked. "I'm thinking that either Ashton Kensington Blake is the best actor in the world, or you just witnessed a genuine transformation," she said. "And I'm not sure which possibility scares me more." "Why does either one scare you?" "Because," she said, pulling into my driveway and turning to look at me, "if he's acting, then you're setting yourself up for the kind of heartbreak that could destroy you. And if he's genuine, then you're setting yourself up for the kind of love story that could change everything. Either way, there's no going back from here." She was right, of course. There was no going back. The girl who had walked into the library the previous Tuesday was gone forever, replaced by someone who had discovered her own power and was learning how to use it responsibly. The boy who had humiliated me about my dirty shoes was also gone, replaced by someone who was grappling with questions of identity and authenticity and trying to figure out how to be worthy of forgiveness. Have you ever been at a crossroads like this, where you had to choose between safety and possibility? Where you had to decide whether to trust someone who had hurt you but seemed genuinely committed to change? Leave a comment and let me know, because I was about to discover that sometimes the biggest risks lead to the most beautiful rewards. The following week at school confirmed that something fundamental had shifted in the social ecosystem of Millbrook. High Ashton continued his pattern of changed behavior, but more importantly, other students began to notice and respond. Kids who had previously been targets of his cruelty started to relax around him. Teachers seemed pleasantly surprised by his increased participation in class discussions and his willingness to help other students. Even the cafeteria workers, who had long been on the receiving end of entitled attitudes from wealthy students, began to smile when they saw him approaching. But the real test came on Friday night at the football game. Millbrook High's stadium was packed with the usual mix of students, families, and townspeople who treated Friday night football like a religious experience. Magnolia June and I arrived early, claiming seats in the bleachers where we could see the field but weren't in the thick of the social maneuvering that typically dominated these events. Ashton found us just as the teams were taking the field for warm-ups, carrying a bag of popcorn and wearing the kind of nervous smile that suggested he wasn't entirely sure how this evening was going to go. "Room for one more?" he asked. "Always," I said, scooting over to make space. What followed was a revelation in social dynamics. Instead of holding court with his usual crowd, Ashton spent the evening genuinely engaging with the people around us. He cheered for the team with real enthusiasm, bought concessions for kids whose families clearly couldn't afford them, and had actual conversations with classmates he'd previously ignored or dismissed. But the